I'm glad you're here with me again. Let me take you back to a town called Golden in the 1870s, a place that looked busy enough to hide its own fears. Wagons rolled through the main street from dawn until dusk, and the smell of fresh-cut timber mixed with coal smoke and wet wool. New signs went up. Old ones came down. Money changed hands quickly, but trust did not. People spoke softly when the subject turned to debts or contracts, as if the walls themselves were listening. It was a town learning how to grow faster than its conscience, and in that narrow space between hope and greed. Certain names were never spoken aloud. One of those names was Arthur Blackwood. Everyone knew who he was, even if they pretended not to. A mountain trader, they said. A big man who came down from the foothills with furs packed clean and tight, each bundle marked, each delivery on the day he had promised. What unsettled people was not that he demanded payment, but that he never reminded anyone twice. If you dealt with Arthur Blackwood and kept your word, nothing would go wrong. If you didn't, afterward you would be wishing you had paid him on time. The stories were always told the same way. Lowered voices over counters or at the back tables of saloons. 3 days after a missed payment, a man would appear. Tall, thin, dressed in black so fine it looked out of place in a frontier town. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He asked questions, polite ones, about permits, about ownership, about agreements that no one had bothered to read closely. After his visit, shops closed, accounts unraveled, families moved on. There was no spectacle to point to, only the aftermath. No one ever said the man in black worked for Arthur Blackwood. That was only an assumption, and assumptions were safer than facts. What fascinated me was how this fear existed alongside another truth. There was one person in Golden who did not speak of Arthur Blackwood with dread. Her name was Beatrice Doyle. Beatrice owned a small dressmaking shop near the center of town. She was young, but her hands were skilled, and her work had earned quiet loyalty. People trusted her because she did not rush what she made. She measured twice. She cut carefully. She treated fabric as if it carried memory, not just value. Those who watched her noticed the way she worked with her head bent and her shoulders steady, as though attention itself were part of the craft. Arthur Blackwood came to her shop often. He did not linger. He did not browse. He placed his orders, agreed on terms, and returned on the appointed day. Always on time, always with payment settled exactly as promised. He never argued over price. He never asked for special consideration. He never once altered an agreement after it had been made. At first, Beatrice found him unsettling. His size filled the doorway. His silence drew glances from others on the street. She knew the stories as well as anyone. She knew about the infamous 3-day deadline, the man in black, the shops that vanished. But unease, she understood, was not the same as danger. With Arthur Blackwood, there were no surprises to most people. Arthur Blackwood represented consequence. To Beatrice Doyle, he represented punctuality and trustworthiness. Arthur arrived when he said he would. The furs were as good as promised. Beatrice's work was finished on schedule. They exchanged what was owed with a brief nod and went their separate ways. The first sign of trouble was the way Frederick Benson began to speak. He came into Beatrice Doyle's shop with the manner of a man making conversation, not accusations. He spoke of how Golden was changing, how the arrival of the railroad had altered the worth of certain streets. He mentioned opportunity the way others mention weather, inevitable, impersonal. Beatrice listened while pinning a sleeve, answering politely, assuming the remarks were nothing more than idle observation. She had always believed that steadiness invited peace. If she paid on time, kept her shop orderly, and caused no offense, she would be left alone. Then a letter arrived. It was written in clean, deliberate handwriting. The rent would be increased, effective immediately. The new rate was nearly double the old one. In addition, a deposit equal to 1 full year's rent would be required, payable within 7 days. Failure to meet these terms would result in termination of the lease. Beatrice read the letter twice, then a third time, as if repetition might soften its meaning. Only a week earlier, she had paid in full for her winter supplies: wool, lining, buttons, thread, everything she needed to keep the shop alive through the cold months. The money had felt well spent then. Now it felt like a door closing behind her. She opened her ledger. The numbers refused to cooperate. She reached for the lease agreement. The document had been signed years ago, back when the shop was new and the ink still smelled fresh. Beatrice had skimmed it then, trusting that its length meant thoroughness and that fairness was implied by formality. Now she read it slowly, her finger tracing each line. Halfway down the third page, she found the clause that allowed the landlord to revise terms if the property's commercial value changed. It had been there all along. Her ignorance settled over her like a weight. She had built her business stitch by stitch, but she had never learned how to defend it on paper. Her stomach tightened. She had not been tricked. She had simply not known enough to protect herself. She understood. Too late. That good faith did not replace legal understanding. The fault was not entirely Benson's. It was hers, too. By afternoon, the sign appeared in the window looking for tenant. Arthur Blackwood arrived on the day he always did. His gaze moved immediately to the window, to the sign taped there in plain view. He paused, then stepped inside. Beatrice heard the door open and felt the shift in the room before she looked up. He stood tall and still, his presence drawing the air inward. She was surrounded by papers, receipts, contracts, calculations that no longer mattered. When she saw him, she startled, knocking a stack to the floor. The sound echoed too loudly in the small space. "I brought the shipment," Arthur said. Then, after a moment, "Why is there a notice on your window?" The question unsettled her more than any demand could have. Beatrice had prepared explanations for suppliers, for customers, even for Benson. She had not prepared for Arthur Blackwood, the man whose name people spoke in whispers, the man whose debtors did not survive intact, the man she had trusted because he had never once broken a promise. "I can't pay you today," she said. The words landed between them, heavy and irreversible. She waited for what the town had taught her to expect. Silence, withdrawal, the beginning of consequences. Instead, Arthur set the crate down carefully and looked at her, not at the ledger, not at the papers, but at her face.
What happened?"
he asked. The simplicity of the question broke something open. Beatrice found herself explaining everything: the rent increase, the deposit, the clause she had failed to understand. She admitted, quietly, that she had signed a contract without truly knowing its weight, that she had believed diligence could shield her from harm. Arthur listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence that followed was not cold. It was measured. "You didn't break your word," he said at last. "You were put in a corner. The distinction startled her. To Beatrice, the result felt the same. Arthur did not mention payment. He did not remind her of the agreement they had made. Instead, he spoke as if stating a route on a map. "If you marry me," he said, "this problem ends." Beatrice stared at him, stunned. Marriage had never entered her calculations. It was not a proposal. It was an offer. She saw, suddenly, what it would cost. Her freedom, her name, her life as she had planned it. Beatrice did not know how to answer and asked for time. Arthur gave it without protest and left. 3 days passed. On the 4th, Frederick Benson returned. This time he brought a prospective tenant, a man who walked the shop with open approval. When the man left, Benson turned to Beatrice, his voice calm. "The new contract will be signed soon enough," he said. "I'll expect the shop to be cleared by the end of the week." There was no anger in his tone. He did not need it. That afternoon, Beatrice closed early. She locked the door and stood alone among the shelves she had built with her own hands. Pride had kept her from asking questions when she should have. Now pride had nothing left to offer. She finally made her decision. The wedding was small, practical, over before the town had time to gossip. When it was done, Arthur told her there was one more thing she must do: dine with his family the following day. "But I don't have much time left anymore," Beatrice said, thinking of Benson's words. Arthur's reply was calm. "If you've locked the door," he said, "you don't need to worry." The road to Arthur Blackwood's family home ran narrower than Beatrice expected. It slipped away from the town's noise and climbed into a quieter stretch of land where fences were built to last and trees were allowed to keep their shape. The house itself sat back from the road, plain and well-kept, with a porch that had been repaired more than once rather than replaced. Nothing about it announced power or wealth. Beatrice stepped inside, carrying the careful composure she had learned over years of greeting customers who thought they knew more than they did. She expected formality. She did not expect warmth. Mrs. Helen Blackwood rose from her chair before Arthur could say a word. She was smaller than Beatrice had imagined, her hair silvered neatly back, her posture straight from a lifetime of standing when it mattered. Her eyes, however, were quick and curious. "So this is you," she said, smiling as if the sentence had been waiting a long time to be spoken. "I was beginning to think Arthur planned to surprise me in some other way entirely." Beatrice opened her mouth to reply, but Mrs. Blackwood had already taken her hands, turning them gently, examining the calluses without comment. "A seamstress," she said with approval. "I've heard. You have a reputation in town." He never mentioned it. Arthur shifted behind them, but his mother waved him quiet. "Oh, hush, if you didn't tell me. That only makes it more interesting." The meal was simple roasted meat, bread cut thick, vegetables cooked until they tasted like themselves. Beatrice sat stiffly at first, waiting for questions about money or motives. None came. Instead, Mrs. Blackwood asked about fabric, about how winter wool behaved compared to summer cotton, about whether Beatrice preferred working in daylight or lamplight. Arthur answered when spoken to, but mostly he listened. Across the table sat a younger man, clean-shaven, dark-haired, his jacket pressed sharply enough to look borrowed from another life. He spoke easily, offering polite remarks, asking Beatrice about the town as if he were visiting rather than living nearby. His manner contrasted with Arthur's in every way, but Beatrice noticed that Arthur deferred to him without resentment. After the dishes were cleared, Mrs. Blackwood gestured toward the small sitting room off the kitchen. "Come," she said to Beatrice. "Let the men argue over whether the fire needs more wood. I want a word with you." The room smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Mrs. Blackwood lowered herself into a chair and motioned for Beatrice to sit opposite her. For a moment, she studied her new daughter-in-law with frank curiosity. "I hope you'll forgive me," she said, "but I must ask, how long has this been going on?" Beatrice hesitated. "Going on," Mrs. Blackwood smiled, a little ruefully. "Whatever it is that finally convinced my son to bring a wife home, I had stopped expecting it. You see, not because I thought he couldn't, only because waiting had taught me not to." She leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. "When Arthur was younger, I imagined all sorts of futures for him. I used to think I'd be buried under grandchildren by now. Then the years passed, and I learned to let those thoughts go. So you can understand my surprise." Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry if—" "Oh, number," Mrs. Blackwood said gently. "Don't apologize. I'm just curious. There is a difference, darling." She tilted her head. "You don't look like someone swept up in romance. And Arthur, well, he has many virtues. Subtlety in matters of the heart has never been one of them." Beatrice managed a small smile. "He isn't much for talking." Mrs. Blackwood laughed softly. "That's putting it kindly. As a boy, he would disappear for days rather than explain himself. I learned to read his silences instead. They're more honest than his words." She leaned forward, lowering her voice in a way that felt conspiratorial. "Did you know he used to leave his boots by the door no matter how many times I asked him not to? Claimed it saved time in the morning. I told him it would ruin the floor. He fixed the floor instead." Beatrice laughed despite herself. "He's stubborn," Mrs. Blackwood continued, "but he keeps his promises. That's the thing you should know. If he gives you his word, he will break himself before he breaks it. I imagine that can be difficult." Beatrice thought of contracts and clauses, of how carefully she had once believed words protected her. "Yes," she said quietly, "I believe so." Mrs. Blackwood studied her a moment longer, then nodded as if satisfied with something unspoken. "I won't pretend to know how you two came to this," she said. "I don't need to. What matters to me is that he chose you. Arthur does not choose lightly." From the other room came the sound of the younger man's voice, quick, precise, followed by Arthur's slower reply. Mrs. Blackwood smiled faintly. "That's Julian," she said, as if reading Beatrice's thoughts. "My younger son. He takes after his father in his mind, not his manner, always asking questions, always checking the details." She paused. "Arthur raised him. You know, paid for his schooling, kept him fed when there was little to spare. They don't speak of it, but it matters." Beatrice nodded, absorbing this new dimension of the man she had married. When they returned to the main room, Julian stood to greet her again. His handshake brief and polite, his eyes were sharp, but not unkind. He regarded Beatrice as one might a puzzle worth understanding. "It's good to finally meet you," he said. "Arthur doesn't care much for introductions." "So I've noticed," Beatrice replied. Later, as dusk settled and the visit drew to a close, Beatrice stood on the porch beside Arthur. Inside, Mrs. Blackwood's voice carried faintly, scolding Julian for correcting her over the age of the house. Arthur cleared his throat. "She likes you." Beatrice glanced at him. "She likes everyone, that's all." He shook his head. "No, she likes you." They drove on without words. The road held its course, mile after mile. Beatrice had prepared for suspicion, but only found patience. She had prepared for coldness, but actually found humor instead. The shop was dark when they reached town, the windows reflecting only her outline. The deadline drew nearer. The quiet felt deliberate. At this point, I was prepared to fear Arthur, as the town does. Yet I now see a man shaped by responsibility rather than cruelty through his mother's voice. And when I look at Beatrice, her mistake is painfully human. I am no longer waiting for the conflict alone. I cannot wait to see who these people become together. Share your thoughts and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Stay with me as the journey continues. Beatrice had unlocked the shop at dawn, more out of habit than hope. She saw Frederick Benson from inside the shop, his reflection moving across the glass before the door opened. He did not come alone. The prospective tenant, the man she saw the day before, walked beside him well-dressed, attentive. The sort who looked at walls and windows, not for character, but for yield. They paused at the threshold as if Beatrice were a clerk rather than the woman who had built the place. Then stepped inside without waiting for invitation. They spoke in low voices, confident ones, as if the space had already changed ownership. Benson arranged the documents with deliberate care. The prospective tenant hovered close, pen in hand. Benson glanced toward Beatrice only once. His look carried no anger, no triumph. It was the look of a man concluding a process he believed finished. "We won't take much of your time," he said to the tenant. "Everything's in order." Beatrice felt the words strike somewhere behind her eyes. She noticed details she had never paid attention to before the corner of the counter rubbed smooth by years of her hands. The faint chalk marks still visible near the window. The smell of wool and oil and winter soap. This was the last moment she would see the shop whole, she thought. The bell over the door rang as the tenant bent over the papers. It was a merely soft sound, but it broke the room open. Benson looked up sharply, irritation flickering across his face. The tenant straightened, pen hovering uselessly in the air. The man who entered did not rush. He closed the door behind him with care, as if sound itself required discipline. He was tall and lean, dressed in black that belonged to another world, tailored, precise, unmarked by dust or travel. He removed his gloves slowly, placing them in his coat pocket before lifting his gaze. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. His voice was calm, cultivated. "I believe this contract concerns the premises at issue." Benson stiffened. "And you are a representative," the man replied mildly, "of interests that require clarification before signatures are exchanged." Beatrice felt her pulse quicken. The story she had heard about Arthur Blackwood rose unbidden the third day. The quiet questions. The shops that closed without spectacle. She had not believed she would ever see him. Not like this. Not here. The tenant glanced between them, uncertainty cracking his confidence. "Is there a problem? That depends," the man in black said, turning to Benson, "on whether you intend to disclose the full scope of your obligations." Benson forced a laugh. "This is a private matter. We're in the middle of signing." The man finished for him. He gestured toward the pen. "Yes, I see." He stepped closer to the counter, his movements unhurried, and rested two fingers lightly on the papers. He did not pull them away. He did not claim them. The gesture alone was enough. "I have a few questions," he continued, "about the amendment clause you invoked, about the repair credit listed on page 3, and about the zoning notice that should have been filed last quarter." The room went very still. Benson opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "That's not relevant." "It is," the man replied, "if the tenant intends to operate under the assumptions presented here." The tenant frowned, reading now with a different eye. What notice Benson's smile thinned. "This is unnecessary. The lease is sound." The man in black inclined his head. "Then there will be no difficulty answering." He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply waited, the silence stretching until it became conspicuous. Beatrice watched Benson's fingers tighten against the counter, his composure slipping in increments too small to notice unless one was looking for them. "I don't have those documents with me," Benson said at last. "Of course," the man in black said. "Then it would be prudent to delay." The tenant hesitated, then slowly set the pen down. "I think I'd like to review everything before committing." Benson rounded on him. "There's no need." "There is," the tenant replied, suddenly cautious. "I won't sign today." He gathered his coat, nodding once to Beatrice in apology, and left the shop with more haste than dignity. Benson stood frozen, the air around him hollowed out. "You had no right," he said, his voice low and tight. The man in black met his gaze evenly. "You'll find," he said, "that rights are rarely as straightforward as people assume." He turned then, as if the matter were settled, and addressed Beatrice directly. "Mrs. Blackwood." The name struck her harder than any threat. She looked at him properly for the first time. The familiar line of his mouth, the clarity of his eyes. Julian. Understanding moved through her in a single, silent wave. When Benson stormed out, slamming the door behind him, the shop seemed to exhale. Julian removed his hat. "The lease will need revision. Fair terms. No coercive deposits. No punitive clauses disguised as market adjustments." Beatrice nodded, though her thoughts were still catching up. "And if he refuses," Julian's expression did not change. "He won't." She studied him. This man she had met at a family table, now revealed as the quiet force behind the town's most persistent fear. Why, she asked. Julian considered her for a moment, then spoke plainly. "My rule is simple," he said. "I always help family." He said nothing more. He did not wait for gratitude. He left the shop as quietly as he had entered, his work complete. Arthur arrived later. He did not ask questions. He looked at Beatrice and seemed to understand enough. "It's settled," she said. He nodded once. Beatrice felt the temptation then, the urge to demand more, to insist that Benson be undone as thoroughly as he had intended to undo her, to ask Arthur to finish what had been so effortlessly begun. "I don't want him ruined," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I want the lease corrected. I want the rent set to what it should be, and I want to keep working." Arthur watched her, then nodded again, slower this time. "That can be arranged." When he left, Beatrice remained behind. She smoothed the papers, swept the floor, and restored the room to its familiar order. The shop was hers again because the law had been made to behave. The real fear had never belonged to Arthur Blackwood. It had belonged to the absence of rules, to contracts written to deceive, to power exercised without restraint. What remained after the trouble was not relief, but exposure. The shop was safe again. The lease had been corrected. The numbers made sense. By any reasonable measure, Beatrice Doyle had returned to solid ground. And yet, in the quiet that followed, she felt less protected than she had during the storm. There were no deadlines now, no men with papers, no visible enemy to resist. There was only herself, and the life she had nearly lost. That was the unsettling part. She found that safety required something different from courage. It required honesty. And honesty, she had learned, was harder. Arthur came as he always had, but Beatrice noticed what she had been able to ignore before. He did not step inside unless she acknowledged him. He did not assume a place. He remained, deliberately, just beyond the threshold. It was a habit born of restraint, not distance. Arthur Blackwood did not push. He waited. Beatrice told herself that this was proper, that the marriage had served its purpose, that gratitude did not require intimacy. Her pride, carefully cultivated over years of independence, urged her to restore clear boundaries, to stand unassisted now that she could. But pride had nearly cost her everything once already. The question began forming long before she spoke it. It took shape in the quiet hours, when the shop smelled of pressed wool and lamplight, when the work slowed and her thoughts had room to move. She knew the answer might unsettle her. She also knew that not asking would harden something inside her that she was no longer willing to protect. One evening, as Arthur stood outside with his hat in his hands, Beatrice set down her needle and turned toward him. Why, she asked. The word surprised them both. It was not sharpened by accusation. It was not softened by apology. It stood on its own, exposed. Arthur did not answer. This was his boundary. Silence was where he retreated when words threatened to misrepresent him. He was a man built around objectives: deliver the goods, keep the promise, finish the work. Explanations had never improved outcomes in his experience. They only complicated them. Beatrice felt the old instinct rise, the urge to withdraw, to reassert dignity by saying nothing further. Her pride whispered that she had already asked enough, that she owed him nothing more. She stayed where she was. I don't mean the shop, she said quietly, pushing past the resistance in her chest. I don't mean the lease. I mean me. Arthur looked at her then, truly looked. The moment asked something of him that no negotiation ever had. He exhaled slowly. I don't talk about things I can't fix, he said. I know, Beatrice replied. That's why I'm asking. The words landed. Arthur shifted his weight, a small movement that betrayed how far outside his habits this moment had carried him. He glanced toward the street, then back to her, as if checking whether there was still time to retreat. There were days, he began, then stopped. Beatrice did not move. She did not fill the silence for him. There were days. He tried again. When I would arrive early, not because the road demanded it, because I wanted to. He rested one hand against the doorframe, not crossing it. I stood here, he said, and watched you work. You didn't notice. You never looked up. Beatrice felt the words like a quiet undoing. Not fear, not embarrassment, something steadier. I watched your hands, Arthur continued. Not because they were quick, because they were careful. You fixed things people gave up on. You didn't rush. You didn't cut corners. You treated the work like it mattered. He paused, then added, more roughly, I don't understand people well, but I understand effort. I understand building something slowly and protecting it. Beatrice's pride faltered, not collapsed, but shifted. For the first time in the story, she told herself about her own independence. She allowed the possibility that being seen did not diminish her strength. When I heard about the lease, Arthur said, it felt wrong in a way I couldn't ignore. Someone was taking something you had earned, and the rules allowed it. I don't accept rules like that. "So you fixed it," Beatrice said. "Yes." "And the marriage," Arthur's jaw tightened. "That was the part I didn't know how to explain." Beatrice waited. Her pride urged her to step back, to keep her footing by refusing vulnerability. She overruled it. "I'm listening," she said again. Arthur's voice lowered. "I knew that if I intervened directly, it would end temporarily. You'd be safe for a while. Then something else would come along. The only way to make it stop was to change your position in the world." He met her eyes. "I didn't want you dependent. I wanted you untouchable." The words settled between them. Beatrice felt the sharp edge of her old certainty dull. She had always believed protection came at the cost of autonomy. Now she saw that sometimes protection was simply the refusal to let harm masquerade as legality. "You could have told me," she said. Arthur nodded. "I know. I didn't know how without making it sound like ownership." Her pride recognized the truth in that. So did her fear. She crossed the room, stopping just short of him. "Do you know how hard it is?" she said. "To ask for an explanation when you've spent your whole life proving you don't need one." Arthur did not answer immediately. Then, quietly, "I imagine it's like speaking when silence has always worked." They shared a look that acknowledged the effort on both sides. "I didn't stay because I owed you," Beatrice said. "I stayed because leaving felt like pretending this didn't matter." Arthur absorbed that. "I didn't help you because I expected you to stay." "I know," she replied. "That's why I am." The words did not feel like surrender. They felt like choice. Arthur stepped back then, not away, but aside, giving her space even now. "If you decide differently later," he said, "I won't stop you." Beatrice smiled. A small, deliberate act. "I'm not deciding out of fear anymore." She moved to the door and opened it wider. The gesture was simple. The meaning was not. Arthur hesitated, then crossed the threshold. Inside, the shop held them both without judgment. Outside, the town continued on, unaware that two people had just done the harder work, leaving the safety of silence and pride behind. When I look back on this story, I realize it was never really about danger or rescue. It was about how easily a person can be undone, not by cruelty, but by what they do not know, and how pride can quietly keep that ignorance in place. Beatrice's mistake forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Integrity alone does not protect us if we refuse to understand the systems that hold power over our lives. Her near loss was terrifying in its realism. Through Arthur, I see that true authority often looks quiet, even severe, because it is rooted in principle rather than emotion. In the end, love requires you to make difficult decisions, to break out of isolation and speak up, even when silence would be easier.